Prehistory with Josh Berry. Over the next few weeks, we will be diving into the history of Egypt. Here is the full article, Part 1. Prehistory and Predynastic Egypt, circa 3000-1000 BE. The Nile Valley before pharaohs. Long before the first pharaohs ruled a unified kingdom, communities were already experimenting with settled life along the Nile. The river's annual flood, spreading a dark band of fertile silt across otherwise arid land, turned narrow strips of the valley into a reliable agricultural zone in the middle of the desert. This contrast, thin green life surrounded by desert, would shape Egyptian history, beliefs, and politics for thousands of years. In deep prehistory, the Sahara was not yet the immense desert we know today. It shifted through wetter and drier phases, at times supporting lakes, savannas, and herds of animals that hunter-gatherer groups exploited. As conditions became more arid, especially from the 6th to the 4th millennium BCE, people increasingly concentrated near permanent water sources, above all the Nile. Over time, this environmental pressure encouraged the transition from renewable life to more permanent villages with fields and herds. Archaeologists reconstruct this long, poorly documented era from stone tools, pottery fragments, animal bones, and the remains of houses and graves, rather than written records. Writing would not appear in Egypt until the very end of the pre-dynastic period. Yet even without texts, the material remains show a clear trend. From scattered, small camps to more organized communities with social distinctions, specialized crafts, and long-distance contacts. Early Neolithic communities in the Nile region. By around the 6th and 5th millennia BCE, Neolithic communities had appeared in and around the Nile Valley. These groups practiced a mix of agriculture and herding, growing cereals like emmer, wheat, and barley, and keeping domesticated cattle, sheep, and goats. Archaeological sites in both Upper Egypt, the southern stretch of the Nile Valley, and Lower Egypt, the northern delta region, suggest that people were experimenting with settle farming at different paces and in somewhat different ways. In many early villages, housing consisted of simple huts made from reed, mud, and other perishable materials. This makes them harder to detect archaeologically than later mud brick architecture, but where traces survive, they show organized spaces, areas for storage, hearths for cooking, and places where tools were produced and repaired. Such arrangements indicate that people were already dividing work, planning for seasonal cycles, and cooperating in family or clan groups. Burials from these early periods give some of our best evidence for how people viewed death and the community. Bodies were typically placed in shallow pits in the desert edge, often in a flexed position, sometimes with modest grave goods, pots of food or drink, simple ornaments, and occasionally more distinctive items, like stone pallets. The desert location helped preserve bodies naturally, inadvertently foreshadowing later Egyptian concern with preserving the corpse. While these early burials are not yet the elaborate tombs of later ages, they already suggest that death was marked as a socially significant transition, not just a disposal of remains. The Naqada cultures and the rise of complexity. The story becomes clearer in Upper Egypt during the 4th millennium BCE, when archaeologists identify a series of predynastic cultural phases, often grouped under the label Naqada, after a key site. These phases, commonly called Naqada IS-2 and 3, span roughly from about 4000 to 310 BCE. Over these centuries, we can watch an unmistakable trend toward larger, more stratified communities with more sophisticated material culture. Naqada I is marked by increasingly refined pottery, decorated with simple patterns and occasionally with images of boats and animals. People used stone pallets, originally for grinding pigments, possibly for cosmetic or ritual use. Such items might have had both practical and symbolic roles. Wearing eye paint could protect against sun glare, and also carry connotations of status or ritual purity. By Nakata II, certain settlements in Upper Egypt had grown in size and importance. Evidence of specialized craft production appears, including workshops for making pottery, stone vases, and high-quality flint tools. Materials like obsidian and certain types of stone, which do not naturally occur in the Nile region, show up in graves and settlement layers, indicating long-distance trade with areas to the south, the eastern deserts, or the Levant. Long, narrow boats painted on pottery hint that rivercraft were already crucial for moving goods and people along the Nile. Social differences also become more visible. Some graves from this period are larger, contain more and finer grave goods, and occupy more prominent positions in cemeteries. This suggests that certain families or lineages had begun to accumulate greater wealth and prestige. At the same time, the presence of distinctive iconography, motifs like powerful animals, hunting scenes, and boats, points to the emergence of shared symbolic languages that might be associated with clan identities, leadership roles, or regional traditions. Lower Egypt and the northern perspective. While Upper Egypt has provided much of the best-known pre-dynastic evidence, the northern delta region, Lower Egypt, also had its own settlements and cultural traditions. The geography of the delta, with its branching channels and marshes, makes archaeological work more difficult. Fluctuating river courses and later occupation can obscure early sites. The following state was in subject all. Nevertheless, finds from the delta indicate communities with their own styles of pottery, house construction, and burial practices. Some scholars distinguish between Upper Egyptian pre-dynastic cultures and Lower Egyptian ones, noting differences in material culture and perhaps in social organization. This suggests that before unification, Egypt was not a culturally uniform land, but rather a patchwork of regional traditions. Over time, though, Upper Egyptian cultural traits, especially from the Nakata traditions, seem to have spread northward, foreshadowing the political unification that would follow. Trade and contact between Upper and Lower Egypt likely played a major role in this process. The Nile served as a natural highway, encouraging the exchange of goods such as agricultural products, stone, and possibly prestige items. Alongside commerce, ideas and artistic styles would have traveled with people and objects, gradually weaving the two regions into a more integrated cultural zone, even before a single ruler brought them under one crown. Ritual, symbolism, and the seeds of kingship. As predynastic society grew more complex, so did its rituals and symbols. Objects like decorated stone palettes, carved ivory figurines, and elaborate pottery begin to show scenes that seem to be more than simple decoration. They depict processions, animal hunts, boat journeys, and sometimes apparent confrontations between human figures. Such imagery likely had layered meanings, perhaps related to myths, clan identities, or early expressions of political authority. One important feature of pre-dynastic iconography is the emphasis on powerful animals, lions, bulls, and perhaps mythical creatures. These animals would later become closely associated with royal power in dynastic Egypt. The use of animal imagery may have helped emerging elites visually assert their strength, courage, or divine favor, distinguishing themselves from ordinary people. In some graves, the inclusion of animals, either represented or, in some cases, actually sacrificed, could have reinforced the special status of the deceased. Grave architecture itself also evolved. The largest pre-dynastic tombs in certain Upper Egyptian cemeteries are rectangular pits lined with wood or brick, sometimes subdivided into compartments. These more elaborate arrangements, contrasted with ordinary simple burials, suggest that the deceased belonged to a higher social stratum, perhaps early chiefs or pro-kings. The energy invested in such structures hints at organized labor and a leadership able to mobilize community resources. Economy, craft, and early administration. The pre-dynastic economy rested on agriculture and animal husbandry, but by the later Naqada phases, it had diversified significantly. Surpluses of grain and livestock supported specialized craftspeople who did not spend all their time on food production. The production of high-quality stone vessels, finely worked flint tools, and decorated ceramics required skill and practice, and the concentration of such items in certain sites suggests early centers of production. Long-distance trade brought in materials that had prestige value. Copper, likely imported from Sinai or the Levant, appears in tools and ornaments. Precious stones and exotic woods may also have traveled along these trade paths. Controlling access to these goods could enhance the power of local leaders, who might distribute them as gifts or display them to underline their elevated status. To manage agricultural surpluses, trade, and labor, some form of rudimentary administration must have emerged. Even without written records, archaeologists point to standardized storage jars, seal impressions, and repeated iconography as clues to systems of control. Certain marks or symbols on pottery might represent early attempts at recording ownership or contents, a precursor to the fully developed writing that would appear at the threshold of the dynastic period. Violence, warfare, and political competition. The late pre-dynastic period, particularly Naqada III, seems to have been a time of intensifying competition between local centers.
Some evidence suggests the existence of fortifications, or at least defensible positions, while grave goods such as weapons, maces, knives, and projectile points may signify not only hunting, but also interpersonal or intergroup conflict.
Artistic scenes on some objects appear to show bound captives, smiting figures, or chaotic battles. These images prefigure the later, highly standardized Egyptian motif of the king smiting enemies, which would become a staple of royal iconography in temples and palaces. The fact that similar themes appear in the predynastic era indicates that political violence and the idea of a victorious leader were already part of the visual language. Over time, regions in Upper Egypt, such as Hierakonpolis and Abydos, seem to have gained prominence. It is possible that a series of local chiefs or proto-kings competed for dominance over neighboring communities, gradually expanding their control. Eventually, one particular lineage would succeed in imposing authority over a wide stretch of the Nile, setting the stage for the official unification of Upper and Lower Egypt and the beginning of the pharaonic state. The threshold of history, writing and early royal symbols. By the very end of the pre-dynastic period, Egypt stands at the threshold of recorded history. In some late Naqada III tombs at sites like Abydos, early inscriptions appear that many scholars interpret as the first true Egyptian writing. These markings, often incised on tags or vessels, seem to combine pictorial signs with phonetic elements, a system that would evolve into the classic hieroglyphic script of later centuries. At the same time, royal symbols become more standardized. Crowns associated with Upper and Lower Egypt, certain royal names enclosed in frames, and the depiction of rulers in distinctive poses begin to emerge. Later Egyptian tradition would remember a figure named Narmer, often identified with Menes in classical sources, as the unifier of the two lands, merging Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom. However, this unification was not an overnight event, but the culmination of centuries of social, economic, and political development during the pre-dynastic age. The transition from pre-dynastic chiefdoms to a unified kingdom marks one of the most significant transformations in Egyptian history. From small villages clustered along the Nile, through increasingly complex regional cultures and the rise of ambitious local leaders, Egypt had created the foundations for one of the world's most enduring civilizations. The Old Kingdom, with its pyramids and powerful kings, would build directly upon these pre-dynastic roots. Section 1 continued Prehistory and Predynastic Egypt to see 3. 100B CE, Environment and the Making of a River Civilization. To understand why Egyptian civilization emerged, where and how it did, it helps to picture the environment not just as a backdrop, but as an active force in shaping society. The Nile Valley is a long, narrow corridor bordered by cliffs and deserts. For most of its length in Egypt, cultivable land is confined to a thin strip on either side of the river, rarely extending more than a few kilometers before giving way to desert. Each year in antiquity, the Nile would flood during the late summer, spreading water and silt over the fields, then recede and leave behind a band of dark, fertile earth. This rhythm dictated the agricultural calendar and, by extension, much of social life. Communities had to coordinate the timing of planting and harvesting, maintain canals or basins, and ensure that fields received adequate water. Even in the pre-dynastic period, this cycle likely encouraged cooperation. Families and clans needed to synchronize their labor with the river's predictable but demanding schedule. At the same time, the surrounding deserts provided both protection and resources. They limited large-scale invasion from many directions, creating a kind of natural fortress, but they also offered mineral wealth in the form of stone quarries and metal ores in the eastern deserts and Sinai. Early Egyptians would have sent expeditions into these harsh landscapes to obtain desirable materials, further encouraging organized leadership and planning. Climate shifts in the wider region also played a role. As parts of the Sahara dried out, groups who had lived in more verdant zones moved toward reliable water sources like the Nile. This influx may have increased population density along the valley, putting pressure on local resources but also supplying labor and skills. The concentration of people along a single river corridor made it easier for emerging leaders to exert influence over a broad population compared to more dispersed environments. Daily life in pre-dynastic communities. Although our evidence is fragmentary, archaeologists can sketch aspects of daily life in pre-dynastic villages. Most people were likely farmers who grew cereals and pulses and tended domesticated animals. Work would have varied seasonally, intense labor around planting and harvest, quieter periods that might be used for building, craft production, or participation in communal activities and rituals. Houses were probably small and functional, arranged in loose clusters that reflected family ties or social relationships. Storage areas, such as pits or simple above-ground structures, held grains and other staples. A village might have had shared spaces where people gathered for food processing, tool making, or social events. Simple tools, stone sickles, grinding stones, bone awls, would have been part of everyday life. Division of labor likely followed age and gender lines, though the specifics are hard to reconstruct. Men may have handled much of the field work and animal herding, while women managed food preparation, textile production, and care for children. Both men and women could participate in craft activities, religious rituals, and possibly trade. In a small community, everyone would have known one another, and social control would have occurred through kinship, custom, and the authority of elders or local leaders. Clothing would have been made from plant fibers or animal products, perhaps linen-like fabrics in early forms, and leather, combined with simple ornaments such as beads, shells, or small stone pendants. Hairstyles, tattoos, or body paint might also have marked identity, status, or participation in certain rituals. Their direct evidence for these practices is limited. Religion before the gods of Egypt. The elaborate pantheon of later Egypt, gods like Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, and many others, did not spring fully formed into existence at the start of the dynastic period. Their roots lie in the beliefs and practices of earlier communities that experienced the Nile, the sun, the desert, and the animal world has powerful forces. Predynastic burials show that people acted as though death required more than simple disposal. The body's careful placement, the orientation within the grave, and the inclusion of grave goods suggest a belief that the dead needed provisions or companionship in another realm or state of being. Grave goods might include food, drink, tools, and ornaments, items that had meaning in life and might be expected to serve the deceased again. Certain symbols that would later be associated with gods may have originated as local cult objects or clan emblems. For example, animals that became sacred in later times, such as falcons, bovines, or certain desert creatures, might already have held special significance. A clan might identify with a particular animal, see it as a protector, or use it as a symbol on personal items or in rituals. Over centuries, as some local cults gained prominence and were linked to royal ideology, these beings could evolve into fully articulated deities with names, myths, and temples. Natural cycles, day and night, the annual flood, the movement of stars, almost certainly impressed predynastic Egyptians with a sense of order and recurrence. Later Egyptian religion would heavily emphasize concepts like Ma'at, often translated as cosmic order, balance, or truth. While the word itself belongs to dynastic times, the underlying idea that there is a fragile equilibrium in the world that must be maintained through proper behavior and ritual likely grew out of earlier experiences with the regular yet precarious rhythms of nature. Art as a window into the predynastic mind. Because we lack written records from most of the predynastic period, art serves as one of our best windows into how people thought. Pottery, stone palettes, carved ivory, and other decorative items carry images that, while difficult to interpret with certainty, clearly meant something to their makers and users. Boats, for instance, appear frequently on pottery. These images probably reflect the central role of rivercraft in transportation, trade, and perhaps ceremonial processions. A boat might carry not just goods and people, but also symbols of power, a standard, an animal emblem, or an important individual. In later Egyptian religions, solar boats carried a sun god across the sky and through the underworld. These grand myths may be distant descendants of early associations between boats, journeys, and the divine. Hunting scenes are another common motif. They show human figures confronting wild animals, hippopotamuses, lions, or other dangerous creatures. Such scenes may have commemorated real hunts that provided food, hides, or protection for the community, but they also likely symbolized human control over chaos. In later times, pharaohs would be shown dominating wild animals as a sign that they maintained order over both the natural and human worlds. The human figure in predynastic art sometimes appears in poses that anticipate later Egyptian conventions. A ruler or prominent individual might be shown larger than others or in a dominating stance over captives. These visual cues taught viewers how to read power and hierarchy, even before the emergence of elaborate textual propaganda. Over time, these conventions would crystallize into the highly formalized artistic canon that many people associate with ancient Egypt. Cemeteries and the emergence of elites. Cemeteries of the predynastic period provide some of the clearest evidence for rising social inequality. In early phases, graves might be relatively similar in size and furnishing, with variations that could be explained by age, gender, or family wealth. As time goes on, however, certain burials stand out dramatically. Large, carefully constructed graves, sometimes lined with wood or brick and divided into compartments, require significant labor and resources. The goods placed in them might include multiple ceramic vessels, stone or metal tools, jewelry, and luxury items imported from faraway regions. The individuals buried in such tombs were likely leaders whose power rested on control of resources, military strength, religious authority, or a combination of these. The placement of these Olive graves within or near a cemetery might also signal their special status. They could occupy central or elevated positions, be separated from common burials, or be marked in ways that made them visually prominent in the landscape. In life, these individuals may have lived in larger houses, controlled larger storage facilities, or presided over community rituals. Alongside elites, there were probably multiple layers of social ranking: successful farmers, skilled craftspeople, traders, and laborers who had fewer resources. Inequality would have shaped access to desirable goods, marriage alliances, and opportunities for advancement. Over generations, the consolidation of power in certain families or lineages laid the foundation for hereditary leadership, eventually crystallizing into the institution of kingship. Trade networks in the wider world, pre-dynastic Egypt was not isolated. It participated in wider regional networks that connected the Nile Valley to neighboring lands, and these connections mattered for both economic and cultural development. To the south, along the Nile, in what is now Sudan, lived communities that would later be associated with Nubia and the Kingdom of Kush. Even in pre-dynastic times, these regions exchanged goods with Egypt: gold, ivory, exotic animal products, and possibly ideas about kingship and ritual. The southern Nile corridor functioned as a conduit for both resources and cultural influences. To the northeast, the Sinai Peninsula and Levant offered copper, timber, and other materials that the Nile Valley lacked. Early Egyptians may have established seasonal camps, trade posts, or even small strongholds in these regions to secure access to valuable resources. In return, they could have exported grain, flax, crafted goods, or even finished stone objects that were highly prized elsewhere. These networks exposed pre-dynastic Egyptians to foreign peoples, technologies, and symbols. Contact with other complex societies may have encouraged them to innovate in areas like metallurgy, fortification, or administration. At the same time, the ability to control and tax trade routes would have enhanced the power of local leaders who dominated key nodes along the Nile or at its margins. From local chiefs to proto-kings, the political landscape of late Predynastic Egypt likely consisted of multiple small polities, each ruled by a local chief who claimed authority over a cluster of villages and surrounding farmlands. These chiefs may have combined several roles: war leader, chief priest, judge, and economic coordinator. Their power depended on their ability to protect the community, mediate conflicts, and manage scarce resources. As population and wealth increased, competition between polities probably intensified. Chiefs might have tried to expand their territory by forging alliances, arranging strategic marriages, or waging war. Victory in conflict could bring not only land but also captives, cattle, and prestige goods, further boosting a successful leader's status. With each success, a chief's identity might shift from a first among equals figure to something closer to a king who claimed a special relationship with the divine. Iconographic from late pre-dynastic artifacts supports the idea of emergent kingship. Rulers are depicted wearing distinctive headdresses or crowns, standing in commanding positions, or being associated with particular animal emblems and standards. Scenes of a single figure subduing enemies visually assert the idea that one person had the right and ability to impose order on others. Over time, such imagery would underpin the ideology of the pharaoh, who is portrayed as a divine or semi-divine being responsible for maintaining cosmic and social order. The Narmer palette and the symbolic unification. Although it technically belongs at the very beginning of the dynastic period, one famous artifact helps bridge the gap between the pre-dynastic era and the age of pharaohs, the Narmer palette. This ceremonial stone palette, richly carved on both sides, shows a figure believed to be King Narmer, wearing different crowns associated with upper and Lower Egypt, and performing the classic smiting pose over a defeated enemy. While you will likely discuss the Narmer palette more fully in Section 2, it is worth noting here as the culmination of pre-dynastic trends. Many of its features, hierarchical scale, the smiting pose, the use of animal symbols, the representation of standards and processions, have clear antecedents in pre-dynastic art. What makes it distinctive is the way these elements are combined into a coherent narrative of unification and royal power. The palette does not simply record a historical event in modern documentary fashion. It presents an idealized, symbolic version of the king's role as conqueror and unifier. In doing so, it crystallizes concepts that have been developing for centuries: that the land should be united, that there is a single legitimate ruler, and that this ruler embodies both military strength and divine sanction. The legacy of the pre-dynastic age. By the time Egypt enters the historical record with the First Dynasty, many of the structures that would define its civilization are already in place. A complex agricultural economy supports a hierarchy of social classes. Trade ties the Nile Valley to neighboring regions. Religious beliefs connect the human community to natural cycles and powerful unseen forces. Art and symbols communicate ideas about power, identity, and the afterlife. The pre-dynastic age in this sense is not a mere prelude, but the essential foundation. It is during these long centuries that scattered communities along the Nile become integrated enough, economically, culturally, and politically, for a unified kingdom to be thinkable, then achievable. The first pharaohs inherit not a blank slate, but a rich legacy of customs, technologies, and beliefs. When you move into the early dynastic and old kingdom periods, you will see how these foundations are transformed and amplified. Writing becomes more sophisticated and is used for administration, ritual, and commemoration. Monumental architecture appears on a scale previously unimaginable, culminating in the Great Pyramids. Royal ideology, already visible in pre-dynastic symbols, grows into a comprehensive vision of kingship that will endure in evolving forms for millennia. Next, we will be exploring early dynastic and Old Kingdom, circa 3100 2181 BCE, joined by our resident